Canada is going to have to come to grips with the fact that over the last 5 years, there's been a major shift in the global energy system and the global economy. What's happened is that China has emerged as the world's first electrostate. That means it's electrifying its economy on both the demand side, like EVs and heat pumps, and on the supply side with wind and solar and batteries. At the same time, the United States has retrenched under President Donald Trump as a petrostate. So I'm going to be talking to Dr. Chris Bataille, who's an energy economist and the co-author of a chapter in a new report, and it's titled Canada at a Climate Policy Crossroads, Petrostate or Electrostate. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Great to be here, Markham.
I think that what you've done here with your co-authors is exactly the right framing. And we're going to be doing this in a series of interviews, probably 4 or 5. So let's use this interview to explain the framework. Petrostate versus electrostate. If you could give us an overview, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These terms have been floating around for a while. We've been talking about petrostates since the 1970s with the development of OPEC in countries where, petroleum is just a big part of their reserve, of their exports and how they made a living. But the term electrostate maybe emerged a couple of years ago, first publicly in a Financial Times article. And it was this idea of a country that was developing towards using mainly electricity, both on the final demand side and on the supply side, and just starting to eschew fossil fuels entirely. And it was obviously in the context of China, which has a lot of coal, but very little oil, almost no gas, right? So given the technological developments we've arrived at, it's in their interest to jump over and become, on a supply and demand side, electrostate. Now, about last spring, some colleagues of mine at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, Tatiana Matrova and Sophie Corbeau, put those two things together and said, look, we have this collision here in this, sort of Trumpian world between countries that are going hard towards electrostate, so China and the EU, and then countries that are going towards petrostate. Now, what's super interesting is the US developed a lot of the electrostate technology, but is now actively sort of stopping support of it and what have you, and trying to retrench back to oil and gas and coal and what have you. But even Saudi Arabia, which is the classic petrostate, is very actively investing in solar and batteries because they're trying to maximize their export revenues from the crude oil that they have. But let's stop there because that's a lot right there.
And the interesting thing to me, Chris, is where Canada fits into the definition of electrostate versus petrostate. Maybe you want to address that.
Yeah, no, what's really, because we're a big geographically dispersed country, we're a federation with various distinct powers falling to the provinces, mainly from energy and natural resources, and then federal powers or trade, our biggest taxation, signing treaties. The whole climate policy and electrostate, petrostate puts the provinces and the federal government in collision with one another, and it puts the provinces in collision with one another. So we've got, obviously, Alberta and Saskatchewan. They want, right now they want to be bringing up as much oil as possible, coal as possible, gas as possible, selling as much as possible because they see it in their interest. But then you've got Quebec is by far our most prominent electrostate. It's got a whole Hydro Quebec. It's already very electrified, and then BC and Manitoba kind of falling behind it. But you've automatically got a collision within the Canadian Federation on this electrostate petrostate spectrum.
Could I bring in another distinction here that I think is really important, because your title talks about climate policy, but I think we've progressed beyond that. And what I mean by that is that this is now about energy and economic policy, because the electro technologies we're talking about have now caught up to fossil fuel-based technologies and become the low-cost competitive option in most markets. And so it's not just about climate policy now. You have to include economic and energy policy along with it. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I call it the messy middle. There's a lot of different terms for it, right? Where sector by sector, we're at this in-between point where the clean electro technologies some sectors they've evolved to the point where they're cheaper and obviously cleaner at end use than others, and others where, fossil fuel still rules, right? And it's the collision between those two and the infrastructure to feed them and the general policy in support of them where they're battling out with one another. In the end, electrification is going to win both on the supply and demand side, and it's going to be it's probably going to be a mix of solar, wind batteries, and maybe some nuclear supporting it for firm baseload, deep geothermal. It will win. That's just, and on the end use side, it's far more efficient and it's much cleaner for the people using it, and it's far more efficient in doing work. So it's going to win. But the question is, it's getting there, right? And we have a very fossil fuel oriented global system today, and how slow or fast you go kind of determines where you are on the spectrum.
Well, let's deal with, first of all, the electoral provinces, because you and I both live in British Columbia. And, Alberta next door is like the Texas of Canada. It's a petro province. BC is kind of, an electoral province, but still has LNG projects and produces quite a bit. It's the second largest producer of natural gas in Canada. But Quebec is very different, and we don't hear a lot about Quebec out in Western Canada, but
Exactly.
but it has been leading the charge within Canada around EVs, around adding wind to hydro, solar to hydro, those sorts of things. Maybe you could just give us an overview of what Quebec has been up to.
No, Quebec, well, it has Hydro-Quebec. What's interesting is you have basically a state-owned crown corp, right? And it's very large, makes a lot of money for the province of Quebec, mainly selling power to New York and what have you. They still have quite a bit of new capacity they can add. They can add more turbines. They can add wind to keep the whole. They can basically keep on adding clean capacity and bringing clean industry to the province. And there's almost no fossil fuel extraction in the province, right? So you don't have this political collision between interests within the province. They can just line up behind electrification and no one really loses. Almost everybody wins, right? It's a matter of getting it all built and getting the finance and the demand for it. BC and Alberta, BC is sort of a mixed schizophrenic case, right? Where we have a highly, almost 95% hydro, maybe a little hydro higher. We can add more wind if we like. We've done, there's, it's a very green, the politics are green, or it's very high, IT and high tech orientated province. But as a skeleton in our closet, we're also a big metallurgical coal exporter. When that coal is used for making steel in East Asia, the emissions are higher than all of BC's together. And we're slowly becoming an LNG exporter. There's a lot of gas that's very friendly, gas in Northeast BC that we're building an industry to export it as LNG, but it's going to require a lot of electricity. It'll add to our emissions. And there's a collision there between, coal export interests, LNG export interests, and then everything else we do in the province. And Alberta had the fastest growing wind and solar industry in the country. It very easily could have been a mix. It could have, cashed in on all of its oil and gas and built lots of renewables and developed a net zero, chemicals industry. But it's chosen not to. It squashed its renewables industry and is doubling down on mainly oil sands exports.
Well, we should point out that Alberta is the petro. It's the equivalent of Quebec on the petro side.
Yes.
Saskatchewan, essentially, which has less oil but burns a lot more, burns coal in its electricity side, is also a petro state. And then Newfoundland and Labrador, where oil and gas, or at least oil, now it plays a very prominent role in the economy. And what maybe position these two provinces the other two, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, in the same kind of political economy framework as Alberta?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So Alberta and Saskatchewan generally play ball or team up with on most issues they team up with each other. Saskatchewan's got, Alberta has a much more diversified economy, that could speak for itself. Saskatchewan has a lot of mining, agriculture, what have you. Newfoundland is a different case because it's a different kind of oil and gas extraction. It's in deep water, it's very expensive. It's almost zero fugitive emissions, right? There's very little methane's leaked, unlike in Saskatchewan and Alberta, right, which is the first and fastest way you can reduce emissions because you can't have fires on platforms, right? So almost no methane is leaked, and the oil and gas comes up, it's put on a boat, it's sent somewhere else, and Newfoundland knows there's limited amounts of low quality oil that can be exported from there. Like it's a one-off thing that cannot go on forever. Whereas Alberta's sitting on several hundred years worth of bitumen, right? And Saskatchewan's sitting on several hundred years worth of coal. Like if they could wave a wand and wave climate change away and export fossil fuels forever, they would, because they could. Newfoundland cannot. It will run out fairly rapidly.
Let's wrap up this interview with a discussion of politics and culture in the petro-provinces. And the next video will be talking about context and governing structure and how that affects this conflict between petrostate, petro-province, electro-province, where Canada is going. But it's become very clear to me, over the 15 years that I've covered oil and gas and energy in Alberta, that the political culture is absolutely saturated with oil and gas. And they tend to, when they look at the future of energy, and this is, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is the perfect example, they look to OPEC for leadership. They look to
Mm-hmm.
ExxonMobil for leadership. So the ideas that, the way they frame the energy future is plenty of demand growth for LNG, for gas, for oil, all the way out to 2050 and beyond. And that has a profound effect on their politics and Canadian politics.
Yeah, and this is a question of like oil energy economics and what we build and what we don't build, what we make and don't. It's not just about the money. It's about the policy. It's about the policy to produce or not produce, the implicit or explicit industrial policy. What support government gives to and what it doesn't. Now, the renewables industry in Alberta is case in point. It was a very fast growing, very profitable sector that could have led to other industries. And the Alberta government has chosen, for ideological sort of point of reasons, to basically squash that industry into oblivion. And despite that, solar keeps getting installed because it's so cheap. Right? It's when your government starts running against the grain of global technoeconomics, you've got a bit of an issue at hand.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to the next interview.
Looking forward to it.